Good morning, folks. I hope you've all had a very good week, and thank you for tuning into the news at Ben again. Now, before I go to the couple of news items I thought I'd touch on this week, there was one issue I wanted to draw your attention to, and it's this, that it seems to me that we live in a 24-hour news cycle at best. News stories that are really important come and go, and once they've gone, they tend not to resurface. And I think the two stories of recent times, I mean, there's so many, I think that we as a people need to keep firmly in our minds and at the forefront of our minds. But the two that I want to touch on before moving to the news are these. One, the incarceration of all those people following the Southport protests and riots, 70 odd people who were put in prison for what they said and tweeted rather than what they did. And we must always remember the extremely sad death of Peter Lynch in prison, a 61-year-old grandfather who really did nothing wrong that I could see. I mean, he had some stuff up on a placard that looked like conspiracy theory, and he was angry with the policeman. There was no reason for him to be in prison, and not a single politician has fought for an inquiry into his death, how it was that he was charged, how it was that he pleaded guilty and didn't seem to have proper legal representation, and then how it was he came to die in prison. And for every Peter Lynch, there are dozens of other stories, including, of course, one that has also caught the public's imagination and ebbs and flows in the public's mind, which is the incarceration of Tommy Robinson for the showing of a film in breach of a civil injunction, which the venomous Lord Hermer, a man who defends terrorists, promotes the interests of illegal migrants, would hand over Chagos Islands to a foreign power. That Lord Hermer, the Attorney General, a political appointment by the Labour Party, decided would convert Tommy Robinson's civil breach into a criminal action and had the courts throw the book at him. And before everyone says, oh, you're a Tommy Robinson apologist, I'm not. I don't know Tommy Robinson. This isn't about Tommy Robinson. It's about all the people who have suffered a similar fate in our politicised criminal justice system. And we've got to bear that in mind. The fact that we don't live in a society where the lady above the Old Bailey is blindfolded. We don't live in that society anymore. The old lady is not blind. Justice is not blind. It is taking into account who you are, where you came from. Sometimes it finds favour with your background and your disposition, and sometimes our justice system doesn't. And if you happen to be in the latter category, you're in trouble. And of course, the same applies to the gang rape gangs. Again, that came into our public conscience because of the way Elon Musk brought it back to the fore. Massive debates about it. Lots of debate in Parliament as well, and now it's all gone quiet again. And this week, 3 Bengalis were sentenced. I mean, goodness, why it took so long to sentence them, because I think their crimes date back to the early 2000s and the 1990s for dozens of rapes against underage girls, and their sentences were not even whole life. Unbelievable. And when you look at those gentlemen and you look at the crimes they've done, you have to ask yourself, how the hell is it that our authorities didn't stamp on this earlier? How is it that social services, the police, schools, local communities, hospitals and so on didn't come to the rescue of these innocent young girls who were raped and abused at the hands of these men? So I want people, please bear these two stories in mind, because they reveal a sickness at the heart of our society against which we must fight, come hell or high water. Now I'm going to move on to the two stories. And the first news item I'd like to discuss is Jonathan Reynolds, the so-called business secretary, an individual who has absolutely no business experience. But it also turns out he's got no legal experience. And why is that relevant? Well, it's relevant because he has, for years, repeatedly lied in Parliament and elsewhere, claiming that he is a fully qualified solicitor. And this is highly relevant to British interests. The public should be absolutely up in arms about the fact that there is a member of the cabinet who has lied about his professional qualifications.
Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, is being told by the Tories in Reform he has to resign. Because claims he lied on his CV. What do you make of that?
So he's claiming that he said that he was a solicitor, actually at a Manchester law firm that I know, and it's my neck of the woods as well. And he said that he worked at this particular firm as a solicitor, when in fact it's emerged that he didn't qualify the title and he didn't complete his legal training contract. Now this story exercises me on a number of levels. Very quickly, if you know anybody who's qualified as a solicitor or anything in professional life, a nurse as my learned panellist has here, or anything, then you know it's completed as a result. You get that title as a consequence of years of study, graft and hard work. How dare somebody come along and say they are that if they're not? This is not about self-identification or saying, you know, if I want to be treated as a tomato or a banana or, you know, I'm being facetious here. This is somebody saying they have a right to be respected because of their legal professional life, and they don't.
And when you lie about being a solicitor, actually, it's a criminal offence. Because you're purporting you can provide advice, you can sign statutory declarations, authenticate documents and all that sort of thing, when actually you can't. You're passing off as something you're not. And so it's even worse than Rachel Reeves' apparent lapse of memory when she thought she'd worked in the front office of the Bank of Scotland, and she thought she'd worked for a decade in the Bank of England, when actually neither of those things were true. This is a man who has actually simply lied about the qualifications he has, and yet he is still in office. He should be on the end of criminal charges. What he did was a criminal offence, and Starmer hasn't sacked him. That tells you a lot about where the bar for integrity is in this government and in this parliament more generally. It seems that people can just lie and get away with it. And it doesn't matter who you are, frankly, in parliament or indeed in any other professional capacity in the United Kingdom. If you lie, you should be forced out of your profession. There can be no place for people embellishing their CVs in order to promote themselves, telling lies about their qualifications, holding office as a result, no doubt, of the apparent qualifications and experience they had, which in fact wasn't true. Jonathan Reynolds needs to go. Rachel Reeves needs to go. They need to join the long line of former Labour ministers that have already gone, like Tulip Siddiqui and that Hague woman with the pink hair, who is absolutely inappropriate for Parliament. They need to go. And unless they go, we know that our own Parliament is sick. And the second news item I'd like to discuss is one that's been rumbling on for a few weeks, which are the negotiations between the USA and Russia to bring peace to the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. Before getting to it, I just want to point one thing out, and it's this, that a few months ago, we weren't even able to talk about the prospect of peace between Ukraine and Russia. If we tried to promote the notion of peace, if you tried to do it, you would have been categorized as a Putin sympathizer, as a Putinist, an apologist for Putin. So wrapped in the protective blanket, frankly, I regard it as a kind of woke protective blanket that Zelensky had put in, that any challenge to the narrative of Ukraine and Zelensky must get as much money as they want to prosecute the war in the way that they wish to prosecute it until every single last Russian boot is off their soil. That if you challenge that narrative, you are basically castigated. And so the first thing that Trump's done, and is noteworthy, is actually move the centre of gravity of discussion on that issue so that we can now discuss it. And thank God we can discuss it, because there have been some of us looking at what's been going on in Ukraine and wondering why it is that we're spending billions of taxpayers' pounds on a Ukrainian conflict, which we all know is intractable and is highly unlikely to be won by Zelensky. And the other point that Trump is absolutely spot on about is that money has gone astray. Money in the arms trade goes astray in times of peace. It's a deeply dodgy industry, if you don't mind me saying so. It's doubly dodgy when it comes to war, because the fluidity of movement of arms, the way money moves, the way the armaments move, ammunition moves is not well documented and thoroughly logged. It's just shipped in and dumped, and people have access to it, and the hope is that it will be used in a legitimate way. But I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever, that many people have got rich off the back of the arms trade and the ostensible support of the Ukrainian war. And Donald Trump was absolutely right to cite that. And why should the United States, or indeed the United Kingdom, more pertinently from our perspective, write a blank cheque for a foreign power? All our foreign policy should be done through the geopolitical prism of British national interest. And thankfully, that is now being revealed as a necessary component of the way that we deal with that conflict. And as it happens, I welcome peace in Ukraine. Why are people so reluctant to embrace that peace? The war has yielded no victory for either side over the last 3 years. Very little ground has really been taken or lost for the last 2.5 years or so. It's almost a World War I situation where thousands of people are dying with no betterment for either side. The war has to end, and I welcome its end as soon as possible. And anyone who says that, getting Russia to the table, rewarding Russia with Ukrainian territory is emboldening Russia and encouraging it to attack Western Europe, I say absolute nonsense. The only thing that would encourage Russia to invade Western Europe is, one, if we're not properly armed and demonstrably able to resist such an attack, and at the moment we're not. We have yanked the bear's tail and we've poked the bear repeatedly, but we ourselves are not ready for war. We all know the lamentable condition in which the United Kingdom's armed forces now finds itself after years of neglect, years of exploiting the so-called peace dividend. Starmer said he would increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. The first thing he did when he came into office was to kick that into the long grass by opening an inquiry into how it should be done. The second thing he did was to cut spending. You might remember that on the day that Zelensky was authorised to fire British Storm Shadow missiles for the first time into Russian territory, Starmer announced that we were cutting back 2 frigates and cancelling a large section of our helicopter force. Absolute craziness. And Trump is again right when he says Europe needs to sort its own problems out, and the UK must spend more money on its armed forces. And what Starmer mustn't do as well is use this as an excuse to hand over our defence to the European Union, arguing that, well, America's turned its back on Europe, we need to get closer to Europe in order to defend all of Europe. That is nonsense. The United Kingdom needs to arm itself to defend the United Kingdom. And if we do that, if we create the strong independent force that we used to always have and are quite capable of producing, then we need not fear Russia, not one jot. No way will Russia attack a well-armed, capable United Kingdom, given our nuclear weapons as well. So I'm delighted that it looks like peace may be being brought, peace may take place in Ukraine and Russia. I'm delighted by it, and any sane-minded individual should be. And then lastly, I just want to say this before I go, and I said this last week and I want to reiterate it. I'm really hopeful for the future now. For the first time, I can see real light at the end of the tunnel for not just the United Kingdom, but for Western civilization. And it has everything to do with what's going on across the Atlantic. For the first time in 30 or 40 years, nation states are being required to identify themselves as nation states, to take responsibility for themselves and to take responsibility for their people. That may be painful to start with. As America looks after itself and withdraws its support to some extent from Europe. But it is exactly the right medicine that we need to create a proud, sovereign, independent, prosperous United Kingdom. Starmer probably isn't up for the job, but I bet you there will be a government in 2029 that can do it. And on that note, I bid you a very good week. Thank you for listening.